Good afternoon. Welcome to President Lincoln's Leadership Legacy. I am Daniel Smith, President and CEO of Cooperative Network. Thank you for joining us today. This presentation was originally scheduled as part of the Cooperative Business Issues Conference we hold each March in conjunction with CoBank's Minneapolis meeting. Obviously, we had to cancel the conference this year due to the pandemic. Therefore, it is our pleasure to present this information via webinar. Thank you to CoBank and CHS for sponsoring this event. Cooperative Network is one of the nation's largest trade associations, supporting over 250 cooperatives from a dozen business sectors in Minnesota and Wisconsin, through government affairs, advocacy, and education. Please visit our website at cooperativenetwork.coop for more information on our work. All of our cooperatives, along with our fellow associations, businesses, and nations worldwide, are experiencing enormous challenges. What is required from leadership to overcome such challenges? Today, we are joined by Dr. Dan Chase, faculty member of the Gettysburg Leadership Experience. Dr. Chase will share with us lessons from one of history's great leaders during times of crisis, our 16th President, Abraham Lincoln. All participants are placed on mute, but if you can use the Q&A section, please do so to post your questions. This webinar, along with others we are hosting this week, will be posted online for you to review as you wish. Thank you, Dr. Chase, and welcome.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Dan. Please let me know, everybody, first, if you can't hear me. And certainly, as Dan mentioned, if you have questions throughout, please feel free to ask them. I've already asked for some assistance. If I don't get to them, maybe someone will let me know that those questions have been asked. Now, I'm going to go ahead now and stop my video and share my screen. Wish me luck here with the technology. There we go. As Dan mentioned, I appreciate that introduction. We're going to talk about something that I think it's always interesting, right? There are very few people that would say, "Oh, I don't want to learn about Abraham Lincoln." But as he mentioned, given current global conditions and what you're doing in your cooperatives, there may be no more relevant time to study Lincoln, specifically Lincoln, and the crisis that he faced and how that challenged his leadership and what he did to surmount that challenge. So I'm excited to spend this hour or so with you to talk about this very, very heavy topic, and we'll try and do what we can to kind of squeeze it into a reasonable time frame here. Now, let me share with you something first and foremost. What you see there on your screen is called the Tower of Books at the Lincoln Museum at Ford's Theater. And the reason that I share that is so that you see how much, and the reason they do it is just there's just an overwhelming amount written about Abraham Lincoln. Now, we don't have exact figures, but the general consensus is that over 16,000 books have been published about Abraham Lincoln. And that doesn't include movies, doesn't include articles, which would also be in the thousands, of course. And this is all, as far back as his earliest might be when he ran for president beginning in 1860 up until the new publications every day. So they have that Tower of Books there. But Lincoln, of course, usually when I do this live, I ask how many people have seen Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter. And, half a dozen or so people kind of sheepishly raise their hands. There's nothing to be embarrassed about if that's maybe your only exposure to Abraham Lincoln, or some of your exposure anyway. That's totally acceptable. But we want to separate. You see that Abraham Lincoln is so popular, right, that he's used to sell cars, Subway sandwiches, movies, things like that. Lincoln, in the American ethos, has this prominent role as sort of this unassailable leader. And of course, I am a Lincoln fan, but we want to look at Lincoln the man, Lincoln the president, Lincoln the leader, as opposed to this myth that he never did anything wrong, or that the challenges that he faced were, somehow isolated to his day and no longer relevant to us. In fact, one of the things I like to do with folks is I want to share a story that I think really taps into the heart of who Lincoln was. And this story is of dubious origins, but has kind of persisted. So Lincoln, of course, had these famous debates now. Lincoln ran for president in 1860 when he was elected November 6, 1860. But in 1858, he ran for the Senate from Illinois. And he ran against Stephen Douglas, right? Who, of course, he would run against as president. But Lincoln, they had these 7 really kind of profound history-shaping debates, 7 of them all over Illinois. And on one occasion, Stephen Douglas accused Lincoln of being two-faced. And as it is today, back then, one of the biggest political insults that you could hurl at somebody was to call them, in our language, we would call them a flip-flopper, right? To say, oh, they're just trying to get your vote. Well, this is essentially what Douglas had just accused Lincoln of, right? Now, Lincoln, as we know, was 6'4", just really absurdly tall for the day. And it wasn't just that Lincoln was tall, Lincoln was awkwardly built. Even when he was a successful lawyer, he seemed to, his peers would say, he never had clothes that fit him right. And the other thing that Lincoln always acknowledges that he was homely, he was ugly, he was kind of strange looking, right? Well, think about, let's set the stage again then. So Lincoln's sitting there in debates, Senate or presidential or political debates in 1858 are very different than today. It was more like an hour speech, followed by an hour and a half rebuttal, and then an hour rebuttal to the rebuttal, right? These long, this is the entertainment of the day. Well, Stephen Douglas says that Lincoln is two-faced. He says to the people of Northern Illinois, right? He says, Lincoln has been telling the people of Southern Illinois, which had more pro-slavery sympathies, things differently than he's telling the people of Northern Illinois. He's two-faced. Well, Lincoln absorbs this massive political insult and doesn't get mad and doesn't lose his cool, right? And sits there and takes it. And then he stands up and it's his turn and he says, my opponent has called me two-faced. He says, I leave it to the audience. Do you think if I had another face, I would come out in public with this one? And of course, there's just uproarious laughter. And who wins the moment, if not the debate? Well, it's Lincoln, right? Well, we love that story about Lincoln because it may or may not be true, but it's just so Lincoln-esque in its telling. But one of the reasons I share that with you is to let you know there's some things about Lincoln that are true and some that aren't, right? This myth versus superhero Lincoln versus the real Lincoln. And so I share this with you, and I apologize, by the way, that the slides that we're looking at here are going to be really text heavy. So stay with me now. You don't have to read these word for word, but stay with me. But we do know this in one of the debates. Think about this. Stephen Douglas, who came from an more aristocratic background anyway, is trying to make fun of Lincoln's lowly origins, right? Lincoln, I mean, grew up in, log cabin Lincoln and, on the frontier, and they knew each other historically. They had a relationship, and Stephen Douglas basically says, oh, I remember him. He was such a good store clerk, essentially. And a store clerk at the time also served alcohol, like a bartender. And Stephen Douglas says, oh, and an excellent bartender he was too, trying to get this dig in at Lincoln, right? And of course, there's the laughter, right? It was a funny line. And Lincoln got up and think how calm and cool this is. What Mr. Douglas has said, gentlemen, is true enough. I did keep a general store and sold cotton, candles, and cigars, and sometimes whiskey. But I particularly remember that Mr. Douglas was one of my best customers. Many a time I stood on one side of the counter and sold whiskey to Mr. Douglas on the other side. But now there's a difference between us. I have left my side of the counter, but he sticks to his as tenaciously as ever. And I mean, just the hundreds to thousands that are hearing this are just like, whoa, just lose it, because it's such a good line. But why share these, right? Because it speaks to something that you're going to see thematically throughout our conversation this afternoon, and that is this idea that Lincoln had this capacity. Other folks, if they were to, what Douglas is trying to do is get him riled up, trying to get Lincoln riled up so that he loses his cool and loses his composure so he can't effectively debate, and Lincoln refuses to do it. In fact, he does this kind of verbal judo. Well, most of us don't have that capacity. We're not maybe that quick-witted, right? But Lincoln, that's not the lesson. What really is the lesson here is this kind of, for lack of a better term, this emotional intelligence or this equanimity that Lincoln is able to possess. But right here, what you're reading here, folks, is the real Lincoln. We know we know that this happened, and it's such an illustration of who Lincoln was. So let's talk about what it is that we can take from Lincoln to adopt into our own leadership today. Now, let me share with you what with the angle, so to speak, that I'm coming from. Now, it's funny. I did a video recently with a business partner, and this is going to sound funny to you because I'm speaking about leadership. And whether you're a CEO or a board member, you probably feel, as you have studied leadership, as you have practiced leadership, it may be that you have felt pressure to enact and verbalize a deep and profound and inspiring vision. It is, trust me, I study leadership and teach leadership for a living, and it is hard to escape. There is this specter of vision. You got to have a vision standing over everybody. And what I do not want to communicate to you today is that vision doesn't matter, but rather I don't want you to feel held hostage to vision. In fact, sometimes what I think is the more constructive leadership perspective is that your job is to preserve institutional integrity. And I want you to think about that always, but in particular, as it relates to the crisis that we're currently facing. So first of all, what does it mean to be an institutional leader? And by the way, Lincoln was an institutional leader. For him, that institution was both the office of the presidency as well as the Union itself, right? But for your institutions, I would argue that your cooperatives are institutions. In other words, they're not just these entities that are out there to make a buck, or they're not just self-serving entities. So it's an organization, as you see there on your screen, founded for a religious, educational, social, or similar purpose. I think cooperatives fit in that. The institution is considered a creation of social needs and aspirations. It is an adaptive, responsive, cooperative system that embodies cultural values. The cultural values and moral commitments of a society are implanted in its institutions. Now, I don't pretend to be able to lecture you on cooperatives and their values and the value they bring to society. I think that speaks for itself, right? And I think you could, in your questions and other things, you can bring that up. But to me, you are leaders of institutions that society, that customers depend on. So I want to kind of shift your thinking to this idea that, wow, we are institutional leaders, and maybe my job as a board member, CEO, or just a cooperative member is to preserve the integrity of that institution. We do this by conserving mission, conserving values, conserving support. We'll get into those more here in a second. A little more here on what it means to conserve institutional integrity, or preserve it, I should say. Again, from Dr. Terry here, institutional integrity is related to the concept of distinctive competence. In other words, what is it that your cooperatives, or I'm just going to start saying your institution, okay? What is it that your institutions do? What service do they provide? What societal value do they contribute that others cannot? What is it that your customers and clients are getting that others cannot provide? So to say that an institution has integrity is to suggest that it is faithful to the functions, values, and distinctive set of unifying principles that define its special competence and character. So what is that for you? Only you can define that. And we don't have the time today but to go over this, but if we were doing a live instruction now, I would invite you to actually stop and consider this with fellow board members, with other institutional leaders, and say, what is our distinctive competence? What is it that we do that no one else can do? Well, Lincoln knew this, okay? Lincoln knew this. Remember, his institution, yours is a co-op, his was the Union. Lincoln knew what this was. Now, listen to this from we didn't call it the State of the Union back then, and now we deliver them in January. Back then, they were delivered in December. But he said, the war continues, right? This is the first year of the war. That lasted from 1861 to 1865. In considering the policy to be adopted for suppressing the insurrection, I have been anxious and careful that the inevitable conflict for this purpose shall not degenerate into a violent and remorseless revolutionary struggle. This is the key phrase there, I have therefore in every case thought it proper to keep the integrity of the Union prominent as the primary object of the contest on our part. In other words, I will tell you why I'm willing to wage war over this, and that is, for him, the integrity of the Union, his institutions' integrity. Okay, so there's this repeating theme again. I want you to start in your minds, okay, why is Lincoln a role model for me, even though he's a president, right, of a nation during a civil war? How does this relate? Well, now you're starting to see, just like you, he was the leader of an institution, and for him, he was facing an existential crisis. And he thought, okay, this is worth fighting for, and I've got to preserve the integrity of my institution, that being the Union. Okay. Now, I want you to think about when I talk about preserving institutional integrity, I want you to think about it in two ways. Okay. Now, for Lincoln, preserving institutional integrity included two components, and one is what we'll call a principled integrity. That is being true to what its institution was. And for him, the principles of the United States of America, that union, okay, was found in the principles of the Declaration of Independence. He loved that document. He loved Jefferson's language, right? That we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, for him, that was it. He had to perpetuate that and even help the Union realize it more fully to preserve the integrity, the principled integrity of the Union. But there's another side to this. For him, institutional integrity and the integrity of the Union had to be preserved in a physical or territorial sense. In other words, all the good and the freedom and the liberty that the founding documents talked about were no good if the Union ceased to exist. And if the Confederacy won the war and could shatter the Union simply because they lost an election, then this, what he called the last best hope of the earth, the Union, was gone from the earth. Okay, it was gone. And so think about this for a second. And back in the 1860s, this idea of a republican form of government, this federal system, this republican slash democratic, right, principle-based form of government was a novelty. Now we see constitutional republics all over the world, but at the time, America was it. And he's saying, you guys, if we don't survive physically, all that other good stuff that we talk about in our founding documents it's a joke. This grand experiment loses. Now, what does this mean for you? You, especially right now, as organizations, institutions across the world, including your cooperatives, I suspect, are facing this global pandemic, and its subsequent economic and social impacts. You have to both preserve the integrity of your institutions in a physical, you've got to continue to exist. You've got to be viable. You've got, in other words, there's got to be solvency, right? But you also have to preserve the integrity of your institutions. You can't sell out the soul of your cooperatives to do it. And this is a huge burden to leaders. How do you do both of those? Especially when you're facing a crisis, an existential crisis like the Union was facing in 1861. Well, I don't have specific answers for you. And in fact, I'm not that interested in specific answers. What I'm concerned about is that you as cooperative leaders are asking the right questions and thinking about the right things, and then having discussions, posing those questions to those within your cooperatives. That's really what matters here, okay? Now we see the combination, of course. Dan mentioned that I worked for the Gettysburg Leadership Experience. We see the combination of both the physical and the principled preservation in Lincoln's most famous speech, the Gettysburg Address, right? Brief little speech, 2 minutes. Everyone was kind of shocked when he was done because they expected the person before him, Edward Everett, who was actually the main speaker, it wasn't Lincoln, spoke for over 2 hours, if you can imagine that, from memory. Spoke for 2 hours. But maybe the most stirring lines of that dedicatory speech that Lincoln gave was that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. Okay, this is post-Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln had started to use black troops. Okay, that's that new birth of freedom that he's talking about, which is that principled preservation, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. So how can I preserve the principled integrity of this union, this institution, and its physical territorial integrity? Okay. By the way, this is just so you see the sacrifice that leadership is. Look at June 1860. Lincoln would win the election in November, as I mentioned, 1861. Now look, we know presidents age, right? We see this, the graying that takes place and other things that takes place. Look at this for a second. June 1860 versus February 1865, and of course he would be assassinated in April. Not that long ago, by the way, shot April 14th. died April 15th, 155 years ago. But look at that difference, the toll that leadership takes. And so leadership, especially in a time of crisis right now, is not for the faint of heart. It's for the person that genuinely, authentically cares and understands the distinctive competence, the why of the institution that takes on this challenge. It can't just be, oh, because I got promoted, or hey, because it's a nice role. But are you willing to see your institutions through this and any other crisis that comes on? Now, let me share with you some quick definitions of leadership. I'll leave these up for you to preserve. James McGregor Burns, by the way, was a Pulitzer Prize winning political scientist, actually, who wrote, he's kind of the godfather, for lack of a better phrase, of what we might call transformational leadership. And first put kind of words to this kind of leadership that echoes with us. But I want you to look at this other definition here given from a book called Primal Leadership. By continually reminding people of the larger purpose of their work, the visionary leader lends a grand meaning to otherwise workaday mundane tasks. So part of what you have to do, part of what Lincoln was doing, including in the Gettysburg Address, was saying, the work continues, but let me tell you why it's worth the daily sacrifices that you're making. What you have to do, if you're going to be even more effective leaders, you have to see it. You have to know what the motivations and the values are, the wants and needs of leaders, and what we'll call followers, the members, the customers of your cooperatives, right? Your partners. If you're going to effectively lead. And Lincoln, of course, understood this. He articulated this in many cases, but maybe most eloquently during the Gettysburg Address. Okay. Now, stay with me here. This is the framework that we are going to be working from. Now, I told you that we would talk more specifically about conserving mission, conserving values, conserving support. We'll go into each of those, but here is the poorly constructed. Don't worry about how poorly this framework looks. That's just how it looks in my mind. But first, you have to know your why. And this is what we just spent a few minutes talking about. And by the way, I don't doubt that the 24 plus that are hearing this right now, I don't doubt that you know your why. Part of the challenge, of course, is as we mentioned there on the previous slide of primal leadership, is reminding people of the largest, including yourself, the larger purpose of that work. So know your why, and then you conserve mission, conserve values, conserve support. And while you're doing that, I'm going to introduce you to this term. You might not know the term, but you know the principle of cultivating phronesis. So quickly, conserving mission is just managing your employees with that why in mind and nothing else. So I'm gonna spend some time with you sharing you some examples of you. So it's my research on Lincoln, in one sense, offers very little that's new in terms of saying that Lincoln was a great leader. Most people think that. Or even that he exercised phronesis and knew the why and preserved institutional integrity. The argument that I'm making to you is that what makes him a role model for you and me is, even though he was a president, a chief executive, he still had subordinates that he had to manage. And whether that was generals, whether that was admirals, whether that was cabinet members, right? And so we're going to look at some of specific examples of how he conserved mission in the way he managed subordinates, and you're going to see how this might relate to how you manage subordinates. Now, conserving values is one of the ways you do that is you have to know the values, right, that you're trying to conserve, but then you can't do it alone. How do you build trust with your teams? How do you embrace and manage conflict effectively? We're going to look at how Lincoln did that with some specific narratives. And then finally, how do you conserve support? You cannot be, Lincoln was in one sense a political genius. Although it might not have been recognized at the time, people slowly recognized it as they got to know him. But you and I don't. If we're going to preserve the physical or territorial integrity of our institutions, keep them existing, you have to appropriately adjust as needed without compromising vision and values or the why that we talked about. And you have to be constantly scanning the political environment. You have to understand stakeholders and their interests. Now, what I'll tell you right now is, assembling a team and building trust, managing people effectively, scanning your political environment. There's none of you listening here who are going, oh, I've never thought of those things. I understand that, of course. And leadership, in my experiences, I've worked with groups all over the country, right, that in various sectors and various forms of institutions. It's not that you and I haven't ever considered these things or that this is rocket science. It's this time that you're spending here with us is to think about more fully these things that may be you haven't thought about in a while, or to think about in a new way, and looking at them through a Lincoln-led lens may provide us that opportunity. Okay, so here's our primary model. You're going to see it again. I'm going to remind us of it as we go back to it, right? So Lincoln's particular formula, and the formula for you and us, is preservation of institutional integrity. Remember, that's a physical as well as a principled institutional integrity. How do you keep your cooperative running? And how do you not lose its values and its purpose, right? Plus phronesis, which might be translated as practical wisdom or prudence, political understanding equals effective leadership. Okay, there it is. Now, I'm going to share with you a couple things here. We can skip the law of the situation here for time's sake. I'm not going to take you through all of that. It's just a principle that might be worth looking up to you, just this idea that effective leaders understand the realities of the current dynamics they're in as opposed to abstract principles. But let me share with you this idea of phronesis there on the right side. We've got Plato and Aristotle there. Now, Plato's on the left side of the image pointing up at the sky, and you'll see it's Aristotle, right? His student, who's got his hand kind of towards the ground. That's because Aristotle was the pragmatist and said, I want to know how these things you're talking about, Plato, these ideals, what does that actually mean for governing in real life? So Aristotle said phronesis is virtue that makes us aim at the right mark, right? That you're moral, you're good, and you're trying to accomplish good things, that your cooperatives are trying to accomplish with the practical wisdom that makes us take the right means. In other words, it's having these good aims, but knowing how to actually get it done, right? That's the key here. Now, a little more definitions on phronesis, or this prudence or practical wisdom. A couple of quotes here, again, read along with me. Practical wisdom is the indispensable political skill of harmonizing principle and practice, of narrowing the gap between the possible and the actual, the real and the ideal. Okay, so it combines intellectual ability with character and experience necessary to make wise and sensible decisions in particular human situations. In other words, are you exercising leadership wisdom? Can you take what's happening in your cooperatives at all times, but maybe especially now, given the current pandemic, and say, given these realities, what are the right decisions to make? Right, and this is why, despite many people not having heard this phrase before, people who had studied this, Coopers and Statler in 2008, said phronesis may be the, by the way, think about this phrase, the quintessential management virtue. What I mean, let me explain why I'm harping on this and why I think it's so important for you with your cooperatives. There are lots of people that are really idealistic and really good people and have good motives, but they don't know how to get things done. Right? Then there are other people who really know how to get things done, and they can navigate the political dynamics, right? And they know how to push buttons and get people to do things, but their motives aren't good. They don't have good character, right? We see this. History is replete with examples in both business and government and elsewhere, where people, who are really talented and capable, but they're despots, they're dictators. And so we don't want them. Phronesis is the combining of these two things, okay? And that's why I think one of my favorite comments made about Lincoln, as well as his phronesis, or prudence or practical wisdom, was given from General William Tecumseh Sherman. Now, of course, Sherman and his march to the sea through Atlanta, just cutting a swath, including hard war, brutal war through Georgia, which essentially was kind of really the final death knell in the war. And this swath he's cutting through Atlanta and through Georgia is really kind of what won Lincoln the election of 64, got him a second term. But what's interesting is Sherman, who, by the way, was a virulent racist, did not like Lincoln at first. Think about that for a second. Had met him early on in Lincoln's administration, thought this guy is not up to the task of leading us through this war. Well, because, as you know, Sherman had a relationship with Grant. Grant really liked Sherman. They were of the same mind, kind of this attacking, hard-fighting warriors. Well, he got to know Lincoln better, and it wasn't long after Lincoln's death that Sherman really saw Lincoln's genius and said, of all the men I ever met, he seemed to possess more of the elements of greatness combined with goodness than any other. Now, you think about that for a second. If you had a subordinate who is writing your leadership epitaph, if they were to say to you that you combine more of the elements of greatness combined with goodness than any other person they could think of think of what they're saying about you. And this to me is, without knowing it, right? Sherman didn't know what phronesis was. He didn't study that kind of stuff. But phronesis is articulating it beautifully here. That goodness, that greatness is the ability to get things done, to know how to actually get things accomplished, that what we might call political wisdom and insight with goodness. His motives were pure. In this case, it was purely to preserve the integrity in a physical and principled sense of the Union. That's phronesis, okay? Now, and finally, as it relates here, by the way, I just like this. This is a Time Life picture. You know, they go back and say, hey, what if we colorize these picture? Well, there's a colorized picture of Lincoln. By the way, it doesn't look that ugly there, right? Maybe he's a little hard on himself. But anyway, this is from Lincoln's second inaugural. And tell me if this just does not fit for our times right now and what you're facing as leaders. The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. We are facing a stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, we have not seen this. Look, the closest we've come to this, right, is 1918. But none of us in our lifetimes have seen anything like this. So this situation, this pandemic is anew. We must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country. Well, Lincoln knew that there had to be, now at this point, okay, by the way, 1862, he was just a month away. He had already announced publicly the Emancipation Proclamation, and he would sign it. It would become force of law January 1st, 1863, a month later. And that's what he's telling the nation here. He's like, look, this is a challenge our nation has never before faced, and that's why I'm going to apply new solutions. So when some people, when they hear this idea of preserving institutional integrity, they think it sounds non-adaptive, right? Or change resistant. That couldn't be further from the truth. Preserving institutional integrity is very adaptive, but what you are adapting is, how do I preserve the principled and physical integrity of the institution? I will make the adjustments and adapt as necessary to preserve those things. Okay, so this quote to me is so relevant to our day, right? So again, here's our formula: preservation of institutional integrity, physical and principled. You got to exist, and you got to maintain your values and your purpose. Plus phronesis, that goodness and greatness that Sherman talked about Lincoln. Well, that equals effective leadership. So I'm going to share with you 3 examples. Remember, we talked about conserving mission, conserving values, and conserving support. Well, I'm going to share with you 3 specific. There are other examples, but I want to give you 3 case studies here with Lincoln and how he had to manage. He was a leader who had to give grand speeches, but he also had subordinates like you and me, peers, right, that he would call peers, that he had to work with. Well, here are the 3 difficult, we'll call them employees here, that he had to work with. Think about this. The employee that thinks you're an idiot. Lincoln had this, right? He had a general that just thought Lincoln was a moron, and told him, by the way. The employer, the colleague, the peer, maybe it's a fellow board member, something that thinks they should have your job. Like, I could do it better than they could. Or how about this, the employee or the peer who oversteps his or her bounds, does too much, and doesn't understand the political environment, but says, oh, you know what, I'm going to go off and do this, even though it's not within my scope of responsibility, and gets, kind of makes things run amok and gets the institution into trouble. Well, Lincoln had all of these, okay? Now, what was, so take these 3 kind of difficult employees. Look at this from historian Craig L. Simons. He's a naval historian, okay? And this is what he said: Lincoln's particular genius, and I agree with this, by the way, the particular activity for which he was fit was the ability to see the whole clearly, and more importantly, to manage people around him in a sympathetic, compassionate, yet realistic, right? He didn't just let people off the hook, yet realistic way to move them in the direction that he believed was necessary. So Lincoln surrounded himself, you guys know this, with really powerful, strong personalities, and he did that intentionally because he was secure and strong enough to say, that's okay, they're going to disagree with me, some of them don't like me, but I need the best minds on this if we're going to get through this secession crisis and this war. And then he managed them in a way in the direction towards preserving institutional integrity and nothing else. Didn't let his ego get in the way, but kept focus on, I'm going to manage these subordinates in a way that best leads to our winning the war and preserving institutional integrity. Okay, and that's what you and I need to do. So here we go, conserving mission, right? So first we're going to talk about conserving mission, managing your employees with that purpose and institutional integrity in mind and nothing else. Well, I'm going to stop sharing for 1 second here, And I just want to make sure, I've been talking for quite a bit. I want to make sure, are there any questions or anything, or can I keep going? Okay. I didn't give you much time there, but I just want to make sure you're all hearing me, everything. Okay. Let me go back to sharing my screen then. And we are going to go back to our first case study here. This is actually fascinating. With Lincoln and McClellan. Now, Lincoln and McClellan could not be more different figures. So this is actually Lincoln. You see how big he is there, right? And visiting George B. McClellan. Now, George McClellan, the reason I say they're different is we know Lincoln was raised on the frontier. I mean, literally moving from Kentucky to Indiana to Illinois with his family. His mother died when he was 9. His stepfather remarried, but they like when they moved to the Indiana wilderness, for example, from Kentucky, literally just let's go find open land and let's start building think about this for a second, an open-faced hut, right? That we put a fire out in front of it. Lincoln, in his words, talked about hearing the bears and the panthers at night, and the fire would keep him away. I mean, well, McClellan came from a patrician background. He was wealthy. His dad was terribly successful, the finest education, right? And the other thing about McClellan, so he was aristocratic, wealthy, best education. He looked the part. Little Napoleon, sometimes people call him. He just looked like a general. He was made for this. Well, he was an engineer by trade. Went to West Point, became an engineer. Multiple states wanted McClellan to lead their state regiments, right? Lead their state militias. Well, it was early on, and McClellan was a relatively young man when Lincoln had already kind of gone through the first defeat at Bull Run and said, we got to get someone else. And they said, well, let's get McClellan to lead the Army of the Potomac, kind of the flagship army of all the Union armies. Said, we need McClellan to do this. Well, McClellan, and you'll see this kind of theme running throughout our discussion today, McClellan thought no one was his superior. And certainly not this uncouth, awkward-looking, only self-educated, so in McClellan's mind, uneducated Lincoln should not be his boss, okay? Well, you see, by the way, that's an image of McClellan right there. Well, there are a number of problems with McClellan, and if you hear my disdain coming out of my voice from McClellan, you wouldn't be the first. There are other people that are more apologetic about McClellan, and I just can't stand the guy. But anyway, let me tell you about a couple instances here. So McClellan is kind of handed this massive responsibility, and McClellan, again, thought nobody should be his superior. Well, on one occasion, President Lincoln, McClellan's in D.C. at this point, wants to go call, at the time they'd say call on McClellan, wants to go see him and talk about something. They actually go over to McClellan's residence that he's granted while he's General of the Army of the Potomac. And he's got the Secretary of State with him, as well as one of Lincoln's secretaries. Well, they go to McClellan's residence, and for the time when they were supposed to meet, and McClellan's not there. Okay, there's kind of the first problem. And so Lincoln says, that's fine, you know what, we're gonna wait. And they're kind of waiting in an open, kind of just a waiting room area. And they're waiting for a long time, half hour, right, passes, a little bit more, until finally McClellan comes home. They've been told, by the way, that McClellan was at a wedding, and he just kind of, didn't honor this appointment. So McClellan walks in the door, looks at Lincoln's Secretary of State Seward and his personal secretary, John Hay, looks at him, doesn't say a word, and keeps walking. Well, that's pretty insolent, right, and rude. Well, then they keep waiting, and they're waiting until the porter comes down and says, gentlemen, I'm sorry, General McClellan has retired for the evening. And look, Seward, Secretary of State Seward, is furious, and Lincoln's personal secretary is about to murder McClellan, right? And Lincoln says, look, I don't mind the snub, that's fine, as long as he brings us successes. All he cares about is ending this war that had already lasted longer than people thought it would, and this is still in 1861. He said, that's fine. I don't care, okay? Well, why? Why is Lincoln, I mean, first of all, that kind of being that magnanimous and forgiving, maybe humble, we even say, is just absurd for most of us, especially someone who's a chief executive, right? Well, what is it that McClellan had going for him? McClellan was a brilliant organizer. So in our minds, we think he's this commander of this army, and we think of our armies today. Well, the kind of army or armed forces that we have today didn't exist really in the 1860s. And so what McClellan did, he was a brilliant organizer and driller. And in fact, he turned the Army of the Potomac, instead of sort of this ragtag band of various state militias, into a real uniform and uniformed, actually got them nice looking uniforms and things, army. And one that the soldiers were really proud to be a part of. And Lincoln recognized that ability, and not McDowell and other leaders hadn't really been able to do that. And McClellan was brilliant at this. Now, one of the things Lincoln couldn't stand about McClellan is that he was always whining, always making excuses, and not acting. Instead of attacking, McClellan was a great organizer and driller. He'd put on these parades and these shows of force, and when it became time to act, he'd say, "Oh, our horses are tired. Oh, the Confederate Army has twice as many men as we do," which was never the case, by the way. But he had these inflated numbers of the Army of Northern Virginia, usually. Army of Northern Virginia, their numbers, always inflated. Oh, we can't act until we get more reinforcement. Okay, he's the opposite of Grant, opposite of General Lee, just kind of a really passive thing. But Lincoln understood something. Lincoln would say, because Lincoln got all this pressure to replace McClellan. People were like, he's not doing anything. But Lincoln knew he was a great organizer. And the other thing that Lincoln knew, think about this, and Phronesis here, the Army loved McClellan. They loved him because they made that, first of all, he didn't make them fight, okay, even those that wanted to, but he instilled in them a sense of pride, and Lincoln said he has the Army with him. Now, McClellan was dismissive of Lincoln. He called him the original guerrilla. We have all these letters that we already see kind of McClellan's insolence towards Lincoln, but we have all these letters that McClellan would write to his wife about, oh my gosh, this guy's an idiot. I'm paraphrasing, right? This guy's an idiot, and oh my gosh, I don't know why I have to answer to him or to anybody else, and I'm saving this country. They need me. I could make myself a dictator if I wanted to. And in fact, look at this. So McClellan's kept in for a bit, and there's a serious battle that he finally engages in, right? And he's always asking for more men. Now, I don't expect you to read this whole thing, okay? But I'll point you to a couple of things here, right? But they lost. He says they were overwhelmed by vastly superior numbers. Not true. On no occasion did the Army of Northern Virginia have more men than McClellan and the Army of the Potomac had at his disposal. But he was always like, oh, they have too many, right? The loss is terrible, he says. If I had more men, I could have taken Richmond, the Confederate capital, right? He said, no one need blush for the Army of the Potomac, right? But you need to send me reinforcements at once. As it is, think about this for a second. As it is, the government must not, I should say must not and cannot hold me responsible for the result. Think about that for a second. Okay, it's not my fault, is what McClellan is saying. I have seen too many dead and wounded comrades to feel otherwise, and that the government has not sustained this army. Okay, but listen to what he said here. This is McClellan talking, if I save this army now, I tell you plainly, I owe no thanks to you or any other persons in Washington. You have done your best to sacrifice this army. Yowzers, okay? First of all, let me just tell you a couple things about this. Of course, McClellan did have superior numbers, even though he claimed he didn't, right? And the other thing is, this was so verging on treasonous language that the only reason we know, actually, Lincoln and then Secretary of War Stanton did not actually see those bottom two lines, okay? Because the telegraph worker was so scared of, this idea of kill the messenger. He was like, holy smokes, I am not letting the Secretary of War and the President see this language. If I save the army now, I don't owe any thanks to you. You have done your best to sacrifice this army. He deleted it, right? Or he didn't give that message to, but anyway, you see the general tone. Well, this is Lincoln's response, okay? Look at this patience that Lincoln has. Save your army at all events. I'll send reinforcements as fast as we can. And again, I'm not going to read this whole thing to you. But I thought you were ungenerous in assuming that I did not send reinforcements as fast as I could. I feel any misfortune to you and your army quite as keenly as you feel it yourself. It is the nature of the case, and neither you nor the government is to blame. Okay? Think about the patience that he's having with this subordinate thinks he's a moron that's always going, I don't have enough to do my job, even though he is, there's no question, right? Now, I don't want you to misunderstand, McClellan is supremely talented. And Lincoln wants to give him every opportunity to be successful. This last, and I got to be quick with this last thing that I'll share with you is Lincoln went again to visit McClellan and his troops. It's July 7th, 1862. It's called Harrison Landing. They're in Virginia. And because Lincoln kind of wants to spur him to act again, right? And you kind of see Lincoln there. Top hat doesn't help, but towering over everybody. He's talking to McClellan. Now, here's something that I got to explain. McClellan hands Lincoln a letter. So McClellan was a Democrat and did not think there should be anything to do with Black Americans or slavery, should have nothing to do with this war. Okay, he was vehemently opposed to that. Now, of course, at this point, Lincoln was increasingly making it, was conflating the purpose of reuniting the Union, winning the war, and rights for blacks and ending slavery. And, you know, we see the Emancipation Proclamation coming out in 6 months, that sort of thing. Well, at the time, it was totally improper, but McClellan hands Lincoln a letter telling him what the war should be about. Not discussing military strategy, not anything, but saying you're fighting this war for the wrong reason and all these kinds of totally inappropriate, right? Again, people are ticked off when they find out that McClellan has done this. And what does Lincoln say to his personal secretary, John Hay? He has acted badly in the manner. Like, yeah, that was probably inappropriate, but we must use the tools that we have. Well, at this point, look, Lincoln is the only one, not the only one, but there are people saying, get rid of McClellan already. We got to get rid of him. What are you doing holding on to McClellan? And from a leadership perspective, right, preserving institutional integrity in a physical and principled sense, all Lincoln cared about was winning the war. Why is he holding on to McClellan? He's not really fighting. He hasn't been that successful. The best thing he's done is really has gotten a draw at Antietam in September 17th, 1862. He's gotten that draw with Lee's army in Antietam, Maryland. But there's something, again, that people don't understand. When Lincoln says we must use the tools that we have, there was a dearth of general military talent in the Union. And in fact, Lincoln had tried to get rid of McClellan and said, hey, I want to give it to one of your subordinates, Burnside. And Burnside says, no, I don't want to do it. He was kind of skittish and not really the temperament to be a general and really liked McClellan. I refused 2 times before. In fact, Senator Ben Wade, an abolitionist senator from the North, is coming to Lincoln saying, look, you got it. We're done supporting him. You got to get rid of McClellan. And he says, look, okay, if I relieve McClellan, who am I going to put in command? And Senator Wade says, well, anybody. And Lincoln, of course, ever the pragmatist, right, with his phronesis, said, well, Wade, look, anybody will do for you, but I actually have to have somebody. You say anybody, but there actually has to be someone that will be more effective than McClellan is. Okay, there's that phronesis coming out. You see, now look, finally, by the way, in November, after one demotion and then being brought back after they needed more organization in the army, McClellan is finally relieved of duty. But I want you to think about this for a second, how this relates to you. The only thing, think about the insolence that McClellan showed, and think about the political pressure that Lincoln was getting to replace McClellan. Only once Lincoln had a suitable, what he thought was a suitable replacement for McClellan, and it ended up being Burnside, by the way, who they finally goaded into taking the role, who ended up not being that great. Only once he was able to do that, and once McClellan had done something enough, a violation enough that Lincoln thought it was worth firing, which was, by the way, not reinforcing a fellow general. When McClellan at one point said, oh, let this other general get out of the scrape that he got himself into on his own, Lincoln was like, boom, you're done. The second I have someone I can replace, that I can realistically replace you with without too much fallout, you're gone. But it wasn't until then. It wasn't. Now, most people, without Lincoln's phronesis and without his sole focus on preserving institutional integrity, would have said, oh my gosh, after the first snub from McClellan, would have said, you're gone. But that's not what drove Lincoln. Okay, now you're going to see this in our other case studies. Okay, so stay with me. Remember our formula: preservation of institutional integrity plus phronesis. Those are the things that lead us to effective leadership, and that's what led Lincoln to effective leadership. Okay, so now let's talk about conserving values. Now, I'm going to go through this one pretty quickly. Okay, so stay with me. I just want to give you some case studies from Lincoln's management while he was president. Conserving values here is assembling help in preserving the institutional integrity through a team, building trust, and then if we have time, we'll talk about embracing and managing conflict. Let's talk about Salmon P. Chase. Now, I have the last name Chase. I'm always quick to point out, no relation, okay? By the way, the little bar bet piece of information that I always share with people, Salmon P. Chase was Lincoln's Secretary of the Treasury. He is one of 3 non-presidents to have their face on a bill. The other 2 are Franklin, of course, and Alexander Hamilton. Well, Lincoln, if you want to bet someday, or Lincoln, Salmon P. Chase is the other, and he's on the $10,000 bill. And then usually I pretend like I'm going to show the people in the audience what a $10,000 bill looks like, and I don't carry one, obviously. But anyway, that's Salmon P. Chase. So Salmon P. Chase ran for president against Lincoln for the Republican nomination, lost, obviously, in 1860, thought he should be president. And Lincoln, Chase, kind of like McClellan, kind of felt he was haughty, proud, snobby, an aristocrat, and thought no one was his intellectual equal. And by the way, Salmon P. Chase is standing over Lincoln's shoulder there in this image, okay? But decided after he had to be goaded, had to be persuaded to become the Secretary of the Treasury. What didn't actually have an economic or money background, but Lincoln, even though he was a former political rival, and he knew that Chase wanted to be president, said, I need the best and the brightest, and he knew Chase would figure it out. Said, Chase, I need you to be Secretary of the Treasury. Chase wanted to be president, then he wanted to be Secretary of State, and then finally took the consolation prize, so to speak, of Secretary of the Treasury after Lincoln persuaded him to do so. And everyone said, well, look, if you can't turn this down if you ever want to be president yourself. His friends and his supporters saying, if you ever want to be president, you can't turn this down. It'll seem unpatriotic. So here, by the way, there's Chase on the right there. Doesn't he just look like a snob? But anyway, here's what's really dastardly here. Here he is serving on Lincoln's cabinet, and by the way, doing a great job. What we know now, and what Lincoln even knew then, is that Chase was secret as the war kind of continued to go bad. Remember, the war wasn't going well. Gettysburg was a big victory. Vicksburg and all these in 1863 were big victories. But for the most part, the war was going terribly for the Union. No one expected it to last 4 years. They had more manufacturing, more manpower, and they were getting, you'll pardon the language, they were getting their butts kicked more often than not, okay? So Chase, even though he's a Republican and even though he's serving in Lincoln's cabinet, is secretly running for president. Against Lincoln. Now, here's the thing. Lincoln's no dummy, and he's got his insiders. He knows this is happening. Now, here's what's brilliant about Lincoln. Okay, Lincoln always had a story, a narrative to make an example of the point he's making. People were saying, you got to get rid of Chase, right? He's running for president behind your back. He's trying to unseat you. And Lincoln said, look, I'm disappointed in his character, and then he shared a metaphor, a story from his more rural days. He told the story of a horse. 2 farmers were plowing this field, and there was this, he called it a chin fly, a fly just really biting this horse that was really hurting this horse, and it was tearing through plowing this field and doing a crazy good job because of it. And someone said, oh, they saw that the horse was kind of hurting, and they went and they got the fly that was biting this horse off of it. And the other guy said, you shouldn't have done that. It was the chin fly that was making it go. And Lincoln said, I'll tell you what, think about this for political and practical wisdom. He said, I'm not going to get rid of Chase, and I'm not going to confront him yet about the presidency, him running for president, because that presidency is his chin fly. And here's why. Lincoln and Chase knew that if Chase wanted to be president, he had to do a good job. He had to run on a good record of being Secretary of the Treasury. And again, he was doing a very good job with the Treasury Department, okay? So if he wanted to be president, Lincoln's like, look, I don't care that he's trying to unseat me. Look at what a good job he's doing with the Treasury Department and handling our economy and dealing with, even international economics and people that want to trade with the Confederacy and blah, 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 things like that. And so he says, I'm going to allow it as a chin fly. Then other people were like, Chase, why are you still on the cabinet? Quit. Now, I want you to listen to this statement that Chase told a supporter of his about why he didn't just up and quit Lincoln's cabinet, as well as, there were political ramifications for doing that. But look at this. This is Chase speaking. He says, the president, that's Lincoln, has always treated me with such personal kindness and has always manifested such fairness, and integrity of purpose that I have not found myself free to throw up my trust. So I still work on. Think about that for a second. Here you've got this guy that is sometimes smug towards the president and is behind his back, and Lincoln's not unaware of this, behind his back is running for president, and yet he says the president has always treated him with such personal kindness and manifested such fairness and I love this phrase, integrity of purpose, that I can't throw up my trust, and I still have to give my best effort. And in spite of himself, Lincoln had converted Chase. So as much as Chase is a schemer, as much as he's kind of backstabbing the president here, the president is, he says, has such integrity of purpose. In other words, he knows his why so well and has converted me to that why that I have to work hard at this. I love it. Look, like I said about about Sherman's statement about Lincoln, about goodness and greatness. Look, if someone says this about your leadership, that they have to do, if they have to work hard for you because they know you mean it and because you treat them so well, you are doing something right as a leader. Okay, now let me go on just a little bit more here with Chase. So there's it's called the Pomeroy Committee after Senator Pomeroy from Kansas, who wants Chase to be president in 1864. Well, they had this pamphlet, essentially like campaign materials for Chase, and it got leaked to the press. Well, look, Chase knew everything that they were doing, okay, and even gave them information to put in the pamphlet, that sort of thing, but totally denied it. When it became made public, he was like, "Oh, President, I didn't do this. You know, it's my supporters. I can't control them," and he's panicked. Chase sent Lincoln a letter saying, "You know, I don't know anything about them, and I apologize for this." Well, Lincoln, this is a phrase you're going to see over and over in the next couple of slides, right? I shall do nothing in malice. What I deal with is too vast for malicious dealing. If we're going to put this in our language today, it's like, look, we're doing with our institution, with this cooperative, is too important. The why of our institution is too important for me to be petty. Okay, so here it is. This is a public embarrassment to both Chase and to the president. And Chase, Lincoln knows, is just lying to his face about this, right? So do not read this whole thing. I do not expect you to, okay? But when this pamphlet comes out again, it's an embarrassment to everybody. Now, by the way, as you know, back then, if someone were embarrassed or if someone is subordinate is pouting, you know what they do? They send in a letter of resignation, right? That's what they do. And then the executives will say, "No, I refuse your letter of resignation." You know, and people keep their pride and blah, blah, blah. But look at this underlined statement at the bottom. Lincoln's just saying basically, look, I know about this, and I can't control what my supporters do. Yeah, I'm not going to blame you for what yours do, even though I know you're lying. He says, whether you shall remain at the head of the Treasury Department is a question which I will not allow myself to consider from any standpoint other than my judgment of the public service. In other words, right now, you are still doing such a good job with the Treasury. I do not perceive occasion for change. I'm not going to be petty with you. I'm not going to deal with you with any malice. What we're doing is too important for that. We can't think like normal folks because what we're doing is so important. Okay, think about how magnanimous that is. Think how much focus on the preservation of institutional integrity Lincoln has to do that. Okay, do you or I have that kind of focus on our purpose, on our why, on the preservation of institutional integrity? Well, we're not done with Chase yet. Okay, finally. There's been all these embarrassments with Chase and Lincoln. Finally, for the third time, okay, there's an argument between Chase and Lincoln because Chase wants to appoint a subordinate that usually has to go through, get confirmation from the state. It's for the New York Treasury Department or whatever. And Chase says, I should just be able to appoint who I want. And Lincoln says, well, traditionally we get the senators from that state to give us some names and then we pick. And he asked Chase to do that. And Chase said, oh, this is the last straw. Here's my letter of resignation. And Lincoln says, as you see in that letter there, your resignation of the office of Secretary of Treasury sent me yesterday is accepted. And Chase is shocked. He's like, what? Wait, what? No, okay, never mind, because he's just expecting Lincoln to be like, Lincoln to come crawling and say, I'm sorry, no, I don't accept your letter. But Lincoln was like, we're done here. Plus, I've got someone on your team that I think could do just as good a job, and this is getting ridiculous. Okay, so finally it's time. He doesn't do anything until it makes prudent sense, right? But look at how magnanimous here is getting. He says, your resignation is accepted. But he says, of all I have said in commendation of your ability and fidelity, I have nothing to unsay. And yet you and I have reached a point of mutual embarrassment in your official relation, which it seems cannot be overcome or longer sustained. Why? Consistently with the public service. In other words, our relationship now is strained to the point that it's starting to hurt what it is that we're trying to do here. Okay. Now that it's starting to compromise the integrity of our institution and our war effort, now I'll accept your resignation. Well, way as far back as 1861, a former political enemy, the person everyone thought would be president, William Seward, said Lincoln's he was magnanimous, right? His magnanimity is almost superhuman, and here we see that, right? Now let me share one more thing with you, because Lewis Chittenden, who was an acolyte, a follower of Chase, loved Chase, said, you can't do this. This is going to ruin the treasury. It's going to ruin the war effort, right? And Lincoln says, I don't believe that, right? Yet he says to this supporter of Chittenden, and yet there is not a man in the Union who would make as good a Chief Justice as Chase. And if I have the opportunity, I will make him Chief Justice of the United States. So in other words, he says, look, he's been kind of a weasel about all this, but he's not made for executive branch, but he'd make a good Chief Justice. And really he understood that that's kind of what he wanted. And so Lewis Chittenden, who was mad at Lincoln for firing or accepting the resignation of Chase, said Lincoln must move upon a higher plane and be influenced by loftier motives more than any man. Well, what were those loftier motives? Now Lincoln here is not, he's not a superhero, even though he's called superhuman here, and loftier motives more than any other man. It's that Lincoln loved the Union. Lincoln had a clear sense of purpose. And so where other lesser presidents, lesser executives might have acted unwisely, or might have been petty or other things, Lincoln was only driven by that. Now, I'm gonna move from that and move to our last case study here, okay? Because I want to be respectful of your time. The last thing here is conserving support. In other words, you and I can't be naive to political realities, and if we're going to initiate change, Emancipation Proclamation, use of black troops, 13th Amendment, ending slavery, things like that, we have to constantly scan the environment, right, and make sure that the situation is right for the adaptations and changes that we're making. Well, I want to share you the story of John C. Fremont. Now, Fremont, and I'll do this quickly, is an interesting case because he was actually, in 1856, the first ever candidate for the presidency of the Republican Party. Now, John C. Fremont, if you're anywhere in the West, you'll see every state in the West has towns named Fremont in them, because he was called, the nickname kind of this pathfinder, because he'd kind of trailblazed through the West and he was really famous, right? And he was really well known, and he loved kind of his celebrity status. Well, he ran in 1856, lost, right? The Republican Party was still relatively new, and he lost. But anyway, so he was a kind of a high figure person, and Lincoln appoints him to this important position out in Missouri. So think about it. At this point, the war is just dragging on. Okay, it's longer than anybody had thought. They thought it would be like a 1 month, 2 month, 3 month war at the most, and the Confederacy would be crushed. Well, it wasn't happening that way. At this point, there's 23 Union states, 11 Confederate states. Well, on August 30th, remember here, Fremont is our subordinate that oversteps his bounds. He loves celebrity. Okay, and on August 30th, he issues his own, essentially, Emancipation Proclamation. So he frees the slaves of disloyal Missouri residents. And then also in this proclamation that he issues, he says anybody caught with a weapon against the Union will be shot. Now, why is that weird? Well, think about it. Missouri was not in rebellion. It was one of 4 border states. You see there Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and if you can see there, Delaware. Well, those are slave states, but they didn't join the Confederacy. And in fact, this is critical, not only because of their proximity, right? You see Maryland in particular to the capital, but because of their manpower. And if they joined the Confederate effort, Lincoln just knew that was probably the end of the war. So Lincoln responds. In fact, this will seem funny, but Lincoln was heard saying once, remember, Lincoln has Kentucky roots and he still has a lot of friends there, saying at one point, he's reported to have saying, man, we really hope to have God on our side in this war, but I have to have Kentucky. Okay, I mean, it was that critical that the border states, at a minimum, stay neutral, because if they go Confederate, well, now remember, these are slaveholding states. So Fremont is lauded in the North by abolitionists and others, like, oh, he's a hero freeing these slaves, and Lincoln's like understood that this is going to make things worse. So Lincoln responds. Now, again, don't read the whole thing. But he says, look, there's two things that concern me. First, if you shoot a man according to the proclamation, the Confederates are going to shoot our best men in their hands. In other words, this is just going to be a dirty, bloody war where there are no prisoners and people are just shooting anybody that they have. He's like, he doesn't want that to happen. In other words, the other thing he says, maybe most importantly, I think there is great danger in the closing paragraph in relation to the confiscation of property and the liberating of slaves of traitorous owners. It will alarm our Southern friends. Now, remember Missouri's proximity to Kentucky. Lincoln is reaching out to his allies in Kentucky. Remember, he has roots there, and he's saying, hey, how's everyone feeling about this proclamation? They're saying, they told him, they said, look, those that want to join the Confederacy or who have slaveholding sympathies are going to revolt. Kentucky is going to go to the Confederacy. And Lincoln says, I think it's going to ruin our rather fair prospect for Kentucky. So please modify your statement so it's aligned with the Congress's Confiscation Act, right, which is not just overall emancipation, is much more subtle and less harsh thing. He's like, and by the way, look at what Lincoln writes. This is written in a spirit of caution and not of censure. And he sends him a copy of the Confiscation Act. He's like, you got to follow what Congress is saying. Well, Fremont doesn't like this. He says, this doesn't fit my politics. He's an abolitionist. He says, you got to tell me to do it. I'm not going to do. So again, here we've got a subordinate that's overstepping his bounds. He doesn't understand the environment like Lincoln does. He doesn't understand that he is ruining things in Missouri and Kentucky. And if they lose Missouri and Kentucky and Maryland, that's it. Ball game's over. We don't have a union anymore. We have two countries, right? We have a Confederate States of America and a United States of America. Okay, and this great experiment, Lincoln says, kind of just it's a joke, right? The Republican forms of government don't work. So he said, Fremont says, well, if I'm going to do this, you got to tell me. You can't write me a letter. You got to tell me to do it publicly, right? So here's another, says, your answer, Lincoln says, is just received, expresses a preference on your part that I should make an open order for the modification, which I very cheerfully do. Now, the public, think about Lincoln as a leader here. In the North, there is outrage directed at Lincoln. He is excoriated in the press as being too aligned with slave interests. He's not radical enough, right? He's mollifying. He's mollifying these border states and why this is a war. We got to win it. But they don't understand that Kentuckians were threatening to join the Confederacy. And so Lincoln says, look, I was so assured as to think it probable that the very arms that they'd given to these loyal Kentuckians would be turned against us. And I think to lose Kentucky is nearly the same as to lose the whole game. Kentucky gone, we cannot hold Missouri, nor is I think Maryland. Delaware mattered a little less, right? But these all against us, the job isn't on our hands would be too large. We would as well consent to separation at once, including the surrender of this capital. Fremont did not have Lincoln's phronesis. He did not have his connections. He didn't have his prescience, right? His foresight in saying, you do this, we lose those states, we lose the war. Okay? And yet he doesn't lose his temper with Fremont. He says, I see something you don't see. Well, what happens as a result of Lincoln forcing Fremont to modify this, right? Kentucky's legislature abandons neutrality, and then there's a call for 40,000 volunteers to the Union, and Missouri and Delaware and Maryland all remain neutral. Okay, think about that for a second. All because Lincoln understood the value of conserving support, and he managed. By the way, Lincoln was going to issue his own Emancipation Proclamation, but he was going to do it in the right way and at the right time, when he knew that and by the way, he only freed slaves in the rebellious states, not the border states, not the neutral states, right? He had to keep them loyal. And again, that ticked off a bunch of people, but Lincoln understood this. He was so focused on winning the war, on preserving institutional integrity in a physical and a principled sense, that this is how he managed this overzealous and yet very popular General Fremont. Okay, it's that preservation of institutional integrity plus this phronesis, right? This goodness and greatness that leads to effective leadership. Now we do this through conserving mission, right? Conserving values and conserving support. Now, again, this is really easy to talk about, but I want you to see the real value here. history to me is terribly interesting. I just love it for its own sake. But what I learned a long time ago is that what I really love about history is its applicability to us today, right? The refrain that we're seeing all over and over today is from George Santa Anna that says, and then Winston Churchill popularized it, but those who do not learn from history are condemned to repeat it, or some variation of that we see. Well, I cannot begin to tell you, as institutional leaders facing a crisis, maybe a crisis not before seen in our lives, right? I cannot begin to tell you how much applicability I see from President Lincoln here, right? And so this idea of you recognizing first and foremost that you are institutional leaders and your job is to preserve in a physical and principled sense the integrity of your institutions, and that you must cultivate phronesis. You must do it with practical wisdom, okay, with good character, good intentions, as well as prudence. Understanding the environments, the political environments in which you're working, that more as much as anything will improve upon your already effective leadership. Right now, as you guys know, effective leaders are always improving their leadership. And this, of course, I know you already know so many of these principles. This is a chance for you to, this hour or so, I hope has been a chance for you to step away from the fires that you're putting out, this crisis that you're facing, and say, okay, what could we be doing more effectively? Let me consult with those around me, as Lincoln often did. How can we more effectively preserve? What does it mean to preserve our institution in terms of its, in a physical preservation as well as a principled integrity? And I think Lincoln is a great way of doing that. So I'm going to stop sharing there. I'll reopen the video there. Thank you for the time. We went a little bit over, but I also want to stop now. Are there any questions or anything that you might have? Anything that we need to talk about still? Anything that we rushed through a lot of history there? Anything that's unclear? Any questions how you can more fully develop phronesis or anything like that? Okay, well, I'm going to take your silence as deafening, and I will go ahead and close it and turn the time back over to Dan.
I got one question.
Oh, please.
Where do you see Trump in this?
Holy smokes. Gary likes to start problems, I think. Let me share with you a couple of opinions. I'll give you to stay to keep people from coming at each other's throats. I'll say the things that I've been the value that Trump provides, and then maybe some areas that I would like to see him improve is I would like, one thing that Lincoln did, you'll notice like in that in his writings to his generals and to others, is Lincoln was always willing to take responsibility. Okay. Lincoln was, even when it probably was unwarranted, Lincoln was maybe one of those first kinds of leaders to say, nope, that's not your fault, that's my fault. And I would love to see more of that from Trump. And Trump, it's not in his DNA. I think it would help his political prospects too. If he would just say, you know what, I wish I had acted sooner. Even if it wasn't his fault, if you say, I wish I had acted sooner on whatever else it might be. The thing that Trump is probably doing well that might be Lincoln-esque is what, of course, he's got a private sector background, and I saw a press conference, I think it was the end of last week, where you see Trump touting sort of the involvement, this participatory effort between public and private sector. And I think any solutions, we see this in my own state, I'm involved with this right now, any solutions are going to have to require a public and private partnership. And I think Trump's recognition of that and his administration's recognition of that is probably laudable. So how's that for a safe answer, Gary? Is that fair?
Can you hear me, Dan?
I can hear you now.
Okay. You know what I see? When I've learned more about Lincoln, and I'm 66 years of age, in the last hour and 10 minutes than I learned before. But what I see as kind of an overview of this is Trump loves America, just like Lincoln was so focused on what he did. he just doesn't have the same temperament as Lincoln.
Yeah. Well, there's certainly a temperamental difference there.
Sure.
And whether that's good or bad is of course is up to you. But yeah, there probably is a temperamental difference for sure. I mean, Trump is, and this is not a knock, but Trump is combative, right? And he's kind of under siege. Now, we don't know how Lincoln would have acted in the television age, but anyway, go ahead, Gary. I think you're trying to say something.
Well, it's just so interesting because I would agree with you there, but I think in my perspective, his temperament is so different. And if you could do one thing different with him that would make him more viable to everybody, maybe trying to get along with him, I just think he loves the country. And if you looked at President Lincoln, that was one thing that I just learned. He loved the country.
Yeah, can I, let me share, Gary, let me share with you one other thing that's interesting about Lincoln and his love of the country. It was so strong that Alexander Stephens, who was the vice president of the Confederate States of America, think about that, right? He's a vice president, but he knew Lincoln. They had been colleagues in Congress in the late 1840s. He said that for Lincoln, the country and the Union, he said, rose to the level of religious sublimity. So Lincoln was never a regular congregant at any church. Of course, he believed in God, but he never belonged to any particular religion. But Alexander Stephens, as vice president of Confederacy, 5 years after Lincoln's death, said, oh, you guys don't even get it. He's like, for Lincoln, the country was his religion. You know, that's how he felt. That's why he felt so strongly. He felt so strongly the destiny of the United States as this beacon to the earth, that's why this idea of not allowing disunion was so important to him, right? And that preservation of the institution of the Union was, of its integrity, so critical to him. So thank you for that comment and questions, Gary.
You know, I'd heard that Lincoln never was a churchgoer, but he read the Bible every day.
Yeah, he was spirit. In today's parlance, we'd say he was spiritual without being religious, right? It's kind of the common parlance today. But he certainly became more religious and more spiritual with the devastation of the war. Just in his language, you see it. His references to I mean, he's referring to the Bible and to God in his second inaugural, right?
Dan, this is one of the best co-op meetings I've ever had. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Gary. That means a lot. I appreciate that. Are there other questions, or whether about Lincoln leadership, you know, anything else that we can talk about before we let everyone go? Okay, Dan, do I turn that time back over to you then?
Sure, and thank you, Dan. Thank you, Gary. I agree with your last comments there. This was absolutely excellent. Thank you, Dr. Chase, and thank you to FCC Services. If you wish to learn more about the wonderful program they conduct, the Gettysburg Leadership Experience, please reach out to Cooperative Network or directly to FCC Services. We can certainly help put you in touch with them. I also like to thank our sponsors, CoBank and CHS. But Dr. Chase, your message today holds particular significance at this time, and we greatly appreciate your joining us. Please join us, everyone, tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a webinar on ways to navigate conflict of interest and confidentiality issues in the cooperative boardroom. Registration is still open on our website. Thank you all. Be safe. Be well.